Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're digging into something, well, really quite paradoxical. It's built right into the structure, the architecture of our legal system.
Yeah, it's fascinating and deeply troubling.
We usually think of the law as, the path to justice, but what happens when the very tools designed to make things fair, to get rid of bias, actually end up creating this kind of ethical trap?
That's exactly it. That's the structural problem we're tackling today. We're diving into sources that really map out how certain legal mechanisms, specifically mandatory minimum sentences, have sort of fused with these powerful, morally charged reform movements.
Okay.
And the result, which the sources are calling a moral trap, is a system where just following the procedural certainty, it starts to replace actual moral judgment.
And it traps everyone involved.
Everyone, from the person accused right up to the judge making the final call, they all end up in a morally compromised spot.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that core irony is just huge. Mandatory minimums, that came from a good place, right? The idea was equity.
Absolutely. The intention, on paper, was good. Lawmakers wanted to stop sentences being all over the map, to get rid of bias based on who you were or where you were tried.
But the thesis here, which is kind of startling, is that it didn't eliminate bias, it just transformed it.
It converted it. It took complex human moral thinking and turned it into this cold, mechanical punishment machine.
And that machine forces people, maybe even people who are completely innocent, into a corner where their best option, legally speaking, is to actually punish themselves.
That's the terrible logic of the trap.
Yeah.
That's the core mechanism you need to really get your head around. For you, the listener, this is about seeing those structural pressure points.
The flaws in the design itself.
Exactly. The deep architectural flaws that just squeeze out nuance, squeeze out doubt, all in the name of efficiency or, looking like you're morally correct.
So we're looking beyond just policy didn't work.
Oh, yeah. We're talking about legislative design failure. We'll look at how the system is built to punish you for asserting innocence, because doing that means taking on this massive, mathematically certain risk.
And we'll be touching on concepts the sources bring up, like moral camouflage.
Right. That's where institutions kind of hide behind a mask of public virtue to avoid accountability for other failings.
And ethical gambling.
Yeah, that describes how the whole system starts to bet its moral authority on just looking compliant rather than doing the hard work of finding facts.
Ultimately, it sounds like we're exploring why things we normally link with justice context, doubt, human judgment, why those things are being actively engineered out of the system.
That's the core of it.
So to really understand this, we have to go back to the beginning of the mechanical problem. Mandatory minimums. You said the intent was good fairness, uniformity. Where did it go wrong? I mean, seeking fairness seems like the right goal.
Right. The goal itself wasn't the problem. It was how they defined fairness. That was the crucial misstep.
How so?
Well, they basically mistook uniformity for justice. The moment they put in these rigid, fixed penalties, they effectively outsourced moral reasoning.
Outsourced it to the law books.
To the statutory code, yeah. And things like human discretion, a judge's ability to look at the situation, the context, mitigating factors, rehabilitation potential, all that stuff was suddenly treated as messy, as moral noise that needed to be eliminated for the sake of consistency.
So instead of a judge thinking through, okay, what's fair in this specific case for this person, the system just becomes like an assembly line.
Precisely. Just follow the instructions. And the clearest example the sources point to are those federal drug minimums back in the 1980s.
Right, that era. Big moral panic around drugs.
Huge panic. And that panic, that societal fear, it got translated directly into cold, hard arithmetic, codified right into law.
Can you break down that arithmetic? How do they turn panic into a mechanism?
Think of it like this. All the complex stuff about moral guilt, like what was someone's intention, their background, are they addicted? What was their actual role? Were they a kingpin or just a desperate low-level courier? All that got replaced by one simple thing: weight.
Just the amount of the drug.
There's the grams. If you possessed X grams of a substance, boom. The minimum sentence was Y years. Didn't matter who you were in the chain. It created this rule without reason.
So the judge couldn't step in and say, hang on, this person maybe needs treatment, not 20 years.
Nope. Their hands were tied. They had to apply the formula in the statute. That's the moment mechanical punishment really took over from moral justice.
And that rigidity, that mechanism, it immediately sets up this coercion mechanism, which you said is the real heart of the moral trap for the person accused.
Exactly.
Walk us through that. What happens the moment someone gets arrested and charged under one of these laws? What's the calculation they face?
Instantly. The stakes are incredibly high. because the law itself guarantees a very severe baseline punishment if you get convicted at trial. Okay, so the accused person is immediately caught in the moral trap. Do I fight this? Do I try for full exoneration? Maybe prove I'm innocent? Because doing that becomes an act of extreme legal risk, almost irrational risk.
But wait, why? If someone is genuinely innocent, shouldn't they always fight? How does the mandatory minimum specifically make their innocence a liability?
That's the structural genius and the ethical horror of it.
Yeah.
Let's say the mandatory minimum for the charge is 20 years.
Yeah.
A long time.
Yeah.
The prosecutor comes along, maybe even knowing the case isn't ironclad, maybe even suspecting innocence, and they offer a deal, plead guilty to a lesser charge, and you get 5 years. Guaranteed.
Okay, 5 versus a potential 20.
Exactly. Now, if you say, no, I'm innocent, I'm going to trial, and something goes wrong, the jury gets confused, evidence isn't presented perfectly, whatever, and they find you guilty,
Yeah.
the judge has to give you the 20 years. They have no choice.
Wow. So the choice isn't really guilty or not guilty. It's take 5 years for sure, even if I didn't do it, or gamble my life on getting a perfect acquittal, knowing that failure means 20 years.
You nailed it. That's the coercive calculus. Even if you are factually innocent, the system's structure pushes you, incentivizes you towards that plea deal.
To survive, basically.
To survive the system, you have to kind of adopt its assumption that you're guilty. You accept the label, accept the punishment, just to minimize the potentially devastating damage. The innocent person is literally forced to participate in punishing themselves.
And this must create a terrible feedback loop systemically, right? If lots of people, innocent or not, take these deals out of fear.
It reinforces the whole thing.
The conviction stats go up, and it looks like the harsh laws are working.
Absolutely. The system validates itself. Those high plea rates, the conviction numbers, they get waved around by politicians, by law enforcement as proof. See, we're tough on crime, and it's working.
But it completely hides the reality that those numbers might just reflect fear and risk management, not actual guilt.
Precisely. Procedural guilt, the guilt assigned by the plea bargain process, starts to look identical, statistically, to actual guilt. Even policymakers looking at the data might not see the difference.
That's genuinely chilling. The very statistics we use to judge if the system is fair could be generated by the fear mechanism itself.
It creates a deep instability in the foundation. And once that foundation is shaky, well, the moral agency of everyone else involved starts to crumble too.
Okay, that leads us right into the next section. If the accused person is basically stripped of agency, forced to perform guilt, what does that do to the other players? The judges, the prosecutors, the ones who are supposed to be the moral checks?
Yeah, the sources show this dramatic reduction in moral agency right across the board. Let's start with the judges.
Okay, what happens to them?
Mandatory minimums. They effectively turn judges into, well, almost bureaucratic functionaries.
Oh, just taking boxes.
Right, pretty much. They lose that core judicial purpose, using their insight, their discretion, applying situational judgment. Justice, traditionally, it's about fitting the punishment not just to the crime, but to the person.
Right.
When that's replaced by just reading a preset chart, the judge's role becomes purely administrative. Apply the rule. End of story.
What specific kind of discretion did they lose that really matters?
Oh, crucial things. The ability to consider mitigating factors like, was this person acting under duress? Do they have a history of severe trauma or addiction? What's their potential for rehabilitation? What's the impact on their family, their community?
All the human stuff.
All the human context. And the sources cite judges expressing real anguish. They talk about being legally forced to impose sentences they know are unjust, disproportionate, even cruel in a particular case.
So they become unwilling participants in injustice.
Exactly. They feel complicit. They're forced into an immoral position by the law itself.
Yeah.
That anguish really highlights the structural flaw.
And if the judges lose power, does that power shift somewhere else, like to the prosecutor?
Yeah. Massively. It hands prosecutors this incredible, almost unchecked bargaining power. It's the ultimate coercive tool.
How does that play out? You hear about charge stacking? Is that related?
Correctly. Charge stacking stops being just about, accurately listing all the things someone might have done. It becomes a tactic, a lever to force a plea.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine a prosecutor knows they could technically charge someone with 3 different offenses, each carrying a mandatory minimum. Maybe combined. That's 50 years if they go to trial and lose on all 3.
Okay, a terrifying number.
Right. So the prosecutor offers a deal, plead guilty to just one lesser charge, maybe something that doesn't even have a minimum, and will recommend 10 years. Even if the evidence on the other two charges is weak, that offer becomes almost impossible to refuse.
Because the alternative is just too catastrophic.
Precisely. The prosecutor holds the keys to avoiding that catastrophic trial penalty. So their decision whether to file that extra charge or drop it stops being purely a moral judgment about what's deserved. It becomes a strategic move to get the plea.
And meanwhile, the defendant in all this, they just become a number.
Utterly reduced. Their story, their background, their potential, their struggles, irrelevant. They become mathematical variables in this legal equation.
Demoralized, as you said earlier.
Exactly. They lose their status as a person deserving individual judgment. And this displacement of agency from the defendant, the judge, the prosecutor, that's what locks the moral trap in place. Everyone's following the legal rules,
Yeah.
but the overall result is a system running without any real moral compass.
Here's where it gets really interesting. How did we get here? A system that started with, arguably, moral aims, fairness, uniformity. How did it become so fundamentally, structurally immoral in its operation? There's a philosophical flaw, isn't there?
There is. It's like the system mimics the form of certain ethical ideas, but completely loses the substance. The sources mention Immanuel Kant's philosophy.
Okay, Kant. Universal rules.
Right? His idea of the categorical imperative that rules should apply universally, no exceptions. This system looks like that. Rigid rules, applied to everyone. But it's missing Kant's crucial foundation, the moral reasoning behind the rule.
Yeah.
Kant argued a rule is only valid if you could rationally want it to be a universal law, and your reason for following it has to be moral duty, not just because the law says so.
So we've got the rigid rule following part, but we ditch the part about making sure the rule itself is actually just or good in every single situation.
That's the heart of it. We're left with what the sources call bureaucratic justice. It echoes that old excuse, I was just following orders.
Right.
Applying the preset sentence lets the judge off the hook. Morally, maybe, but it doesn't absolve the state or us as a society from the injustice that might result.
And the source material apparently breaks down how this mechanics-only approach just guts traditional ideas of justice.
Yeah, it hits all the pillars. Take retributive justice, the idea of punishment fitting the crime, being proportional.
Yeah.
Well, when you remove context, and the same huge mandatory minimum applies to a major drug trafficker, and maybe someone selling a tiny amount to feed their own addiction,
Yeah.
where's the proportionality? It's gone.
Okay, that makes sense. What about other kinds?
Then there's consequentialist justice, trying to achieve the best outcome, like rehabilitation, preventing future crime. But if the system's laser-focused only on applying that preset severe penalty, it ignores whether a different approach might actually lead to a better result for that person and for society.
So if you strip out proportionality and you strip out context and consequences, what's left?
What's left, according to the sources, is bureaucratic justice, which they argue flatly is no justice at all. It's just pure mechanism, a machine without a moral compass, perfectly designed to value following the procedure over finding the truth.
Okay, so mandatory minimums built this machine, this procedural box. How do we get to Section 3, where later reforms, often coming from a good place morally, actually ended up amplifying this trap?
Yeah, it's crucial to see it as an amplification, not something totally new. The mandatory minimums set up the high-stakes, rigid structure. Then you have social movements and new laws, things like Marcy's Law, focused on victims' rights, or the intense focus for movements like #MeToo, which came about for really important reasons.
Right, trying to fix historical neglect, institutional indifference towards survivors, that's a necessary moral correction.
Absolutely necessary. But that powerful moral energy, that urgency, when poured into the existing mechanical box, it kind of supercharges the logic that was already there.
So the push to, say, believe survivors and react strongly against institutional failures, that put immense pressure on the system to look like it was taking things seriously.
Enormous pressure. And this creates what the sources call moral acceleration. Everyone in the system, police, prosecutors, judges, feels this intense need to demonstrate that they are morally aligned, that they are vigilant.
And how does that translate into action?
Well, in that climate, getting a conviction, or even just securing a plea deal, starts to be seen not just as resolving a case based on facts, but as proof. Proof that the institution is virtuous, that it's on the right side. And that's where discretion, the space for nuance, just shrinks dramatically.
Let's talk about the structural impact of that. You mentioned procedural compression. What does that mean?
Procedural compression means, basically, in the rush to look like they're doing the right thing, jurisdictions start streamlining things. Evidence rules, sentencing rules. They get simplified. sometimes drastically.
Cutting out the nuance again.
Exactly, cutting out the very discretion that might allow for context or proper corroboration or proportional judgment. It's often a quick fix driven by public pressure or political signaling.
And this simplification, this compression, does it feed into that black and white thinking we see in public arguments? Where everyone involved is immediately labeled believer or denier, victim or perpetrator.
Absolutely. That narrative binary perfectly mirrors the binary logic of the mandatory minimums themselves. It simplifies complex human situations down to easily digestible, morally charged categories.
Which leads, the sources say, to ethical inflation. What's that?
Ethical inflation is when signaling your virtue becomes more important than actually doing the messy work of deliberation. Public discourse starts rewarding the loudest, most righteous-sounding statements.
Okay.
So if you try to raise questions about the procedure, like, should we have stronger evidence standards? Should we talk about rehabilitation options? You risk being seen as questioning the underlying morality itself.
It becomes dangerous socially to even ask those questions.
Very perilous. Your ethical stance becomes less about finding justice and more like a badge you wear to show you belong on the good side. And this creates a chilling effect. It stops vital conversations from happening. If asking about due process gets you labeled as immoral or as siding with perpetrators, then serious discussions about how to improve evidence standards or how to balance rights, they just don't happen. The mechanical trap gets tighter because no one dares question the moral performance.
And institutions learn to play this game, too, using what you called moral camouflage.
Right, moral camouflage.
Yeah.
It's like when an institution uses this public display of virtue, we protect the vulnerable, we have zero tolerance as a kind of shield.
A shield for what?
For maybe obscuring deeper problems like funding gaps for actual victim support, or not tackling root causes of violence, or ignoring the lack of resources for restorative justice. They point to high-profile punitive actions, mandatory training, quick firings, harsh sentences to camouflage the fact that they might not be addressing the systemic issues effectively.
So the good intention protecting people gets tangled up with just performing righteousness.
Exactly. And that ties into ethical gambling. The system starts betting its moral reputation on these visible signs of compliance. It focuses energy on creating these clear good versus evil spectacles.
Why?
Because those spectacles are politically and socially rewarding. They look decisive, even if, in the process of creating that simple narrative, the complex, messy truth gets trampled.
Which brings us squarely into Section 4 and maybe the most disturbing consequence. The point where actual innocence can become almost irrelevant. How did these modern reforms, layer onto the old mechanics, shift investigations away from finding facts towards just complying morally?
The shift is really about priority. When the absolute top priority is to appear vigilant, to satisfy that moral urgency we talked about, the system starts prioritizing the accuser's credibility over a really rigorous, unbiased look at all the evidence.
So the accusation itself carries more weight procedurally.
It can trigger automatic consequences, yeah. Both procedurally within the system and socially outside it, sometimes before there's been a deep dive into the actual facts. The system becomes optimized for looking morally correct, for checking the "we acted swiftly" box, rather than carefully weighing ambiguous details or contradictory information.
And this push for moral compliance, does it shrink the space for investigators to actually investigate? You mentioned mandatory reporting, quick timelines.
Yes, exactly. When officers or prosecutors are under pressure to meet reporting deadlines or show quick results, they're incentivized to check the boxes rather than follow every lead, especially if a lead complicates the initial narrative.
So potentially exculpatory information or just stuff that makes the situation look less clear-cut might get sidelined.
It's a structural risk. The operational logic pushes towards achieving a procedurally defensible outcome that meets the public's demand for moral clarity, rather than necessarily uncovering the whole, often messy truth.
Let's try and ground this. The sources use the Stephen Avery case, his 1985 wrongful conviction, as an example of these structural vulnerabilities. That wasn't just a mistake, was it? It was systemic.
That's how the sources frame it, yes. Avery spent 18 years locked up before DNA cleared him for that initial assault charge. It serves as a stark example of how the system, when driven by a perceived moral certainty, can go wrong.
How so? What went wrong structurally?
Well, even at the time of his first conviction, there was apparently contradictory evidence, hence pointing elsewhere, but the system seemed locked onto him. The pressure, perhaps local political pressure, the moral need to solve this awful crime, it optimized the enforcement machinery for certainty about him.
So the focus became confirming the initial narrative. rather than exploring other possibilities.
It appears that way. Contradictory details might have been downplayed or ignored. And later, appeals ran into the usual institutional inertia, the system's tendency to protect its past decisions, its appearance of certainty.
So Avery's case shows that just being innocent isn't enough if the system's machinery is set up to prioritize looking righteous and getting a conviction.
That's the takeaway. It demonstrates how innocence alone can be insufficient when the whole process is geared towards perceived moral rectitude and procedural closure. The investigation might have checked the required boxes, but it arguably failed the deeper moral test of relentless, unbiased fact-finding.
It masked what the sources refer to as the epistemic limits of governance. That sounds academic. What does it mean?
It just means acknowledging that government, that any system, can't know everything with absolute certainty. It has limits to its knowledge.
Right.
Governance should operate with some humility about that, acknowledging the possibility of error. But when the system, under moral pressure, projects this image of absolute certainty and virtue, it systematically erases the space for doubt, for error, both institutional error and human error. The procedural certainty hides the factual uncertainty.
That leads us perfectly into the final tightening of the screws in Section 5. How these biases get baked into automated systems, creating that double bind. Let's talk about things like registries, sexual assault registries, domestic violence registries.
Right. These registries are a prime example of embedding morality into algorithms, into automated processes. They seem objective, data-driven, but they actually codify the historical biases and the moral judgments we've been discussing.
How does that work? What's the mechanism?
One key mechanism is what the sources call categorical equivalence. It's a huge driver of nuance erasure.
Can you give an example of that? Categorical equivalence?
Sure. Depending on the specific laws, sometimes relatively minor offenses, technical violations, maybe even situations that were ambiguous or didn't involve violence, like a specific type of domestic dispute, can result in someone being placed on a registry with the same severity, the same lifelong consequences as someone convicted of a violent, forcible assault.
Wow, so it flattens everything out. The category is all that matters.
Exactly. Complex human behavior gets reduced to a single enforceable moral label. And once you have that label from the registry, the automated consequences kick in: housing restrictions, job limitations, social stigma, often regardless of the specific facts of your case years ago.
And trying to fight being on the registry or questioning those consequences.
Can be interpreted by the system and sometimes by society as minimizing your past actions, as a moral failing in itself. It enforces compliance. The automated procedure, the label, takes precedence over individual context or rehabilitation. It locks in the moral judgments of the past.
So all these rigid systems, the minimums, the procedural shortcuts, the registries, they all funnel an innocent person into that psychological trap you mentioned earlier, the double bind.
Yes, the impossible paradox.
Can you lay out that paralyzing choice again?
Yeah, it's truly a nightmare scenario, a psychological and moral crisis with no good way out. So, option one, you assert your innocence. You say, I didn't do this, and you decide to fight it through trial. But in doing so, you risk triggering that incredibly severe mandatory punishment if you lose. It's a massive gamble with years, decades of your life.
Right, the catastrophic risk. We keep coming back to that.
We have to. Option two, you accept the plea deal. You plead guilty, maybe to a lesser charge, to get a shorter, more certain sentence, but you do so knowing you're innocent. You compromise yourself legally, morally, socially. You accept a label you don't deserve.
No good options. Personal ruin through fighting or moral ruin through confessing.
It's a structural inevitability in this kind of system. And what makes it even worse is that navigating this, even while innocent, requires a performance.
A performance? How so?
Yes. Innocence itself becomes something you have to perform convincingly. The accused person often feels they need to present this perfect image. Calm, compliant, credible, appropriately remorseful, even while denying guilt.
That sounds impossible.
It's incredibly difficult. Any deviation showing anger, frustration, confusion, even just flat affect, can be misinterpreted by police, prosecutors, judges, even a jury as a sign of guilt or shiftiness. The system starts to prioritize the appearance of justice, the performance of moral conformity, over the actual messy search for truth.
So the ultimate takeaway here is that this moral trap isn't just bad luck for a few people. It's baked into the structure. It converts real human choice into this kind of forced moral performance, and it erases our ability to deal with nuance, with doubt.
That's the systemic insight. It's structurally inevitable when you build systems this rigid, this focused on procedure over substance.
And that insight has to be the starting point for figuring out how to break the trap, right? We've spent this deep dive mapping the problem. What do the sources suggest as solutions? How do we get back to a more humane, more just system?
Well, the primary theme is the need to bring back moral discretion, but smart discretion, accountable discretion.
Mm.
The sources argue forcefully for restoring judicial flexibility.
Letting judges be judges again.
Essentially, yes. Taking away their ability to consider the specific situation, the specific person that removes the very heart of justice, it turns them into clerks.
Okay, what else?
They stress recognizing narrative context in sentencing. The whole story matters. A person's background, trauma, circumstances, their potential that needs to be part of the equation again. We have to stop treating people like variables in a formula.
And getting away from policy driven by fear.
Absolutely crucial. Rejecting fear-based policymaking. So much of this structure was built on societal panic. Panic about drugs in the 80s, panic about certain types of violence now. That fear leads to systems optimized for harshness and procedure, not fairness.
And politically, it's hard to argue for more discretion, isn't it? It gets framed as being soft on crime.
That's the political toxicity that maintains the inertia. Exactly. So to really break the trap, the sources suggest we need to change how we measure success.
How so?
Stop measuring justice by how uniform the sentences are or how many plea bargains get processed efficiently. Start measuring it by moral coherence. Can we ethically justify this outcome for this person in this situation? That should be the standard.
So, recapping the journey here, we saw how structures like mandatory minimums built for fairness accidentally created a rigid machine. Then powerful, necessary moral movements trying to correct past wrongs inadvertently poured fuel on that fire, increasing the pressure for moral performance over factual truth.
Leading to a system that structurally punishes complexity, structurally coerces pleas, and can make innocence itself a liability.
In conclusion, then, the core argument isn't that these systems failed because they weren't tough enough. It's something deeper.
Much deeper. The argument is they failed because they made morality itself unthinkable within the process. By stripping away judgment, by demanding robotic compliance, they created this inescapable moral trap.
So, what does this all mean for you, listening? It means recognizing the hidden costs, that chilling effect on honest debate about justice, the way institutions can hide behind moral posturing, and maybe our own societal tendency to equate severity with virtue.
The system, as designed now, rewards conformity and punishes complexity, even if that complexity is the simple fact of innocence. And remember, it validates itself by pointing to those coerced pleas as proof of success. That's the moral camouflage working perfectly.
Which leaves us with a final, maybe uncomfortable thought for you to wrestle with, drawn from the implications in these sources. If our society increasingly equates harshness with virtue, and we know our system structurally pressures people, potentially innocent people, into confessing, how do we even begin to calculate the true moral cost of policies that value procedural certainty over finding the factual truth, especially when the price of that certainty might be someone's freedom?
A heavy question to end on.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for the deep dive.